want to do in this session is think about narrative and story, and not just at an introductory kind of first level. We've done that before. You've probably heard that kind of material, but really kind of pushing and poking and saying, so how do we preach and communicate Bible story in a way that really, really reflects the power of what God's designed? Because I'm convinced that narrative is incredibly powerful. And so we can talk in terms of John, but this is true for any Gospels, Acts, Old Testament history. It's an awful lot of the Bible, 60, 70 odd percent that is narrative. And so how do we preach it? Because if we preach it simply the way we would preach an epistle, divide it up, communicate the truths one by one, you know what I mean? It's not narrative anymore. And so really we've got to make sure that we're honoring the fact that God inspired the genre. He inspired not just the content and the theology, but the form that it takes. And I think that it's a fun adventure to do that. It's a good thing to discover. And, just to realize, stories are not just for children. Stories, adults love stories. And so as we preach and communicate Bible story, then adults get drawn in. And you'll find that adults who are ready to analyze stop analyzing and they engage. And so you think about how a story works. When people watch a film, normally they're not watching a film taking notes. When they watch a film, they lose themselves. They just become part of it. And that's a good film. And if you find yourself watching a film thinking, oh my goodness, that was poor acting, or that you can tell the person's acting, or the special effects are false, once you start analyzing, the film has lost you, right? But when there's a good film, you don't analyze, you just enjoy, you participate. And so when preaching story, that needs to be the experience that people who are listening find themselves drawn into it. They may take notes, that's not a problem, but hopefully not analytical notes. That was a mistake, or I disagree with that theology. The guard should come down and they should be drawn in. Now, fast forward to the end of the sermon. I just want to make this point. I think this is true of all preaching. This is a question we need to ask ourselves. Any teaching, any preaching, when people walk away, what is the direction of their gaze? Their heart, imagine the eyes of the heart. Okay, so you've got the eyes of the heart down here. Okay, which direction is the gaze? Is it looking at themselves, or are they looking at Christ? And I think that's an important question in all of our preaching, because it's so easy to turn people inwards and to make them think, oh, I've got to work hard, I've got to try more, I've got to. And actually, I think Christian preaching should send them away with a sense of, yeah, I'm being transformed, but I'm looking at Him. He is the one that captivates me. And as we look at Him, we will change. We will be changed. Okay, so just keep that in mind as well with a story, that there's an appropriate application of what difference does this make to us. But the overwhelming sense should be, oh, wow, what a Savior. What a God we have. Tom? That's so much better than that was a great message. I love it when you preach.
Yes.
You're so clever. I hate those comments. Something's gone wrong if people say you're so clever. Oops. Okay, so let's look at the notes. We won't go through these in massive detail, but we'll drop into some of them a little bit. I like this quote from Jeff Arthur's at the top here. Biblical narrative can be defined as a historically accurate, artistically sophisticated account of persons and actions in a setting designed to reveal God and edify the reader. I like that. It holds the tension of historically accurate, but what does he say? Artistically sophisticated. And some people seem to give up one or the other. They're either passionate about the history and don't care about the literature, or they're passionate about the literature and they don't believe in the history. And I think we need both. This is inspired, accurate history. This happened, and look at the way the writer has communicated it. You need to hold both together. So drop down to that big line. Have you seen that one before? The plot line? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just very briefly, just in case it's not a fresh idea, stories always begin with a setting. Use a quick example. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. You can picture that, but you're not excited, right? The tension comes with number 2. Number 2 is where there's a tension created, a disequilibrium. Uh-oh, what's happening? All right, so 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. Ooh, this is going to be interesting. What's going to happen here? There's the tension. You've got these 2 people, one of whom is religiously perfect, the Pharisee, and one is absolutely a sinner. And they're going to pray to God. Let's see what happens. They're probably going to hit each other. There's going to be a fight. I mean, it creates tension. So if you just have the setting, I'm not saying it's inspired, it's wonderful, but it's not interesting. It's just, there it is. A man had 2 sons. I know lots of people with 2 sons. It's not like, oh, I must find out what happens. But the moment the tension comes in, you're not leaving the story. You're going to follow it through.
Do you remember, I think I heard a few years ago, the example of a dog lying on a mat? It was a very boring story. The dog lying on the cat's mat creates tension. It was just a good example of reminding.
Yeah, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And if the start of the story leaves you thinking, I don't care, it's not a good story. But if there's a tension, what happens then? The moment you lean forward, you've got a story. And that tension, whether it's a dog and a cat's mat, or whether it's 2 men who are opposites going into a temple, now you have tension. Really, the key numbers here are 2 and 4 on that line. Those are the important ones. And until you get 2 and 4, you do not understand the story. Okay, you can understand the setting all day long, and you can understand how it falls out at the end, but unless you get the tension, it's just information. Okay, so 2 men went up to the temple, okay. One's a Pharisee, the other's the tax collector. Ooh, interesting. And then it doesn't skip straight to 4. It doesn't resolve the problem. There was a problem that was solved. That's boring. You've got to have time to develop the feeling. So think about that as you're preaching. Do you take time to develop the tension within people? Because if you tell people at the start of a story, here's the tension, here's the resolution, let's look at the story, it's kind of like telling a joke and saying, oh, hang on, do you remember that joke that ends with this line? And the person says, no. Oh, okay, let me tell you. You don't care because you go, okay. But if you hold that back, then the person cares, and they will follow you into the story. So I think sometimes as preachers, we just give everything away at the start, especially if we're trained with epistles. Like, okay, here's my main idea. Boom, give it all away. Don't do that with a story. Let the tension hold people. And if you're a good storyteller, you can hold them for half an hour, no problem, with a story. Because, they care. And actually, with Bible story, you may think, oh, they know the end of the story. It doesn't matter. They still experience all the emotions. Even if you've heard the prodigal son 15 times or 20 times, you still find yourself, your heart beats when you hear it. And you anticipate things, but you feel them. So you get the tension develops, and let that tension develop so that people have time to start to feel, imagine, see the situation. So in the story with the 2 men at the temple, the tension develops as each of them pray. So we listen to the Pharisee's prayer. God, I thank you that I am not like all these sinful people, especially this guy, and I am really good because I fast twice a week and I give a tithe of all that I get. And it's a really arrogant prayer. And it's creating a situation where the original listeners are probably starting to feel a bit of discomfort with the Pharisee. Because on the one hand, they respect him, he's wonderful, and the society is better because of the Pharisees. On the other hand, his prayer is so proud that, do I like him? I'm not sure, but yeah, I should. But there's a tension even within that. And then the contrast with the tax collector, wouldn't even look up to heaven, stood a ways off and just pounded on his chest like a woman at a funeral, and then said, God, have mercy, that's the translation in English, literally, make an atoning sacrifice for me. What you're doing, what's going on beyond that wall, I can't do that for me. I'm too bad. You do it for me. Which is a brilliant, amazing picture, isn't it? And the listeners would be probably thinking, well, yeah, he's bad. It's quite a good prayer, but I mean, he's bad. And there's a tension within both, and the tension's rising. And what's the resolution? And the resolution comes at the end when Jesus says, I tell you the truth, or I tell you, this man and not the other one went home justified.
That's shocking.
It is absolutely shocking. At the very best, you might expect, because of his desperate prayer, God showed mercy and he was justified too. But God says, no, that other one's not justified. And that's a tension resolved, but it leaves you with all sorts of questions, which I think take you on through the rest of Luke 18 and into Luke 19, and all the stories just connect straight from there. And that's the launch of that. And then afterwards, the resolution, there's not much to say. And same with all stories. You don't spend a long time with the denouement or the resolution at the end. Okay, so recognizing that tension of number 2 and number 4 is critical for us as interpreters of story and as communicators, because we've got to create that. And if we tell a story without creating the tension, then it's just going to be flat. It's just going to be pure information. Okay? So let's look down at some of these details here. So the plot, talked about that. Character, we've kind of made a comment about that John Lennox kind of used the characters as the entry point into the emotion and the feelings and so on, because the danger is that we think of preaching as information transfer, but we never think of life as information transfer. If you could go to seminars all day long and get information all day long, and then you phone your wife at home, and if you treat your wife as an information source or an information recipient, it doesn't work. Here's the solution to your problem. You need to listen. She wants you to feel it. She wants you to go, oh, I'm sorry that happened. Because isn't that normal both ways, male and female? We may get information from an instructor, but the people that we're friends with, we share our emotions, we share our feelings. And I'm not sure, and I'm confused, and I'm really hurt, and I'm upset, and all of that stuff is normal life. And so how can we not enter into the narratives through that door? Do you see what I mean? People in stories were feeling something. And so if we kind of get into their shoes, get into their skin, feel the tension, that's going to help us understand and communicate it. Any comments or thoughts? It takes time, doesn't it? You cannot do that on a Saturday night. You've got to really ponder and think and pray and enter into the life of that person.
Digging.
Yeah, just keep digging and engaging. And if the digging is purely here, you're not there yet. There's no empathy. Empathy is not an intellectual exercise. If someone comes to you and they're really, oh, my life is terrible, they need you to enter into that alongside them and feel with. And once you feel with, they say, oh, thank you for your understanding. But if you spend your whole time analyzing, they don't say thank you unless they're just trying to get away. Do you see the difference? So if you actually feel with, then you'll be credited with understanding somebody. If you just analyze to understand, you won't understand. It's the nature of humans. And most of the Bible, God gave it to us in narrative form. Theology in flesh. Theology in the context of normal life. Okay. What about the setting? This is a challenge for us because to really understand the characters and to understand the plot, we have to have an awareness of the setting of the story, of what's going on within that world. Different stories will have different awareness needs. You may need to know geography. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, somehow, if you don't know what that road is, you can still tell the story and it can still make sense. But if you know that road, and if you've traveled that road, even better, because it is scary. I mean, it's scary on a bus. On that under setting there, I put numbers 2 and 3. A well-conveyed setting can do two things. If we do a good job of painting a picture of what's going on in a story, we can ignite the imagination. That's where they start to see on the screen inside them. They start to see the movie of the story. And you're really doing well when people are seeing the story. And also, you're giving them the opportunity, as a result of that, to associate or disassociate. And that is a huge feature of narratives. I think I said this next door, but let me say it in here. As humans, we have no problem. In fact, we don't even think. We automatically evaluate whether we like people, right? You decide within, 30 seconds if you like the waiter or the waitress. You don't even think about it. Maybe after you've decided, you then think about why. But isn't it true, if you're sitting at a table in a restaurant and the waitress comes over and takes your order and walks away, you already know whether you like or dislike, right? For a variety of reasons. That's the same with everyone you meet here at the forum. You sit next to somebody, you introduce yourself, you already are leaning towards or going, oh. There's always a kind of a reaction inside us towards people because we're created as relators. And so our life consists in our responses to people and our connections with people, right? And so two things out of that. One, just a theological thing. It does bother me that there's people in our churches that if you say to them, do you love God? They say yes, because they know that's the correct answer, or maybe they do. But if you ask people, do you like God? I'm convinced there's a lot of people in our churches that don't know the answer. Never thought about it. And to me, that says that they may have been in church for 30, 40, 50 years, and they've never encountered God as a person. Through the preaching, through everything that's happening, God has been simply a set of information, a set of truths, a doctrine they believe. Do you believe in God? Absolutely. I'm a Christian. Do you like Him? I don't know. We should know. If we've ever met a waitress, we know. If we like them, how much more should we know if we like God? And so as preachers, that's a big challenge. If there's people in our churches that aren't attracted to God, we need to start preaching. And not just preaching information, but preaching a person and introducing the person of either God the Father in a lot of texts, or Jesus, the one who reveals the Father preeminently. I mean, somehow the personal nature of God needs to come across in our preaching. So that's just a theological important point. But as we're preaching story, what happens? You present characters. If you do a good job, people will associate or pull away. And we need to develop that, and we need to allow that to develop. We need to allow the time to paint a picture of the people we're talking about. And that means wrestling with the complexity of characters. So, for example, you looked at John 4 yesterday. In that story, do you think the reader is the intent that we would associate with the woman or disassociate from the woman? What do you think? Do we see her as someone that, I can imagine being her, or, I'd rather avoid her?
No, associate.
Why?
Well, because I assume if you're a saved person, then before you got saved, you were like a woman. It doesn't matter how many husbands you had.
Okay. So there's the kind of the brokenness of her life that we can relate to. Yeah.
Not everybody has that background.
No, of
Saved
course.
from that background.
Yeah, of course. But we've all got some brokenness in our background. But then there's the fact that the fact she's there at noon means that she was not liked by her society, her culture, her village, didn't want to be with her. And actually, when we see someone that everyone else is avoiding, our natural reaction is to avoid. And so there's a tension already, because I agree with you that, she's a nobody that Jesus values. She's not Nicodemus, This is Samaritan woman, living in sin, just outcast from her village. She's a confusing character. What about the disciples in the story? Do we find ourselves saying, yeah, or, oh, come on?
And they did not connect with that woman. They were so amazed what Jesus can do this.
Yeah, so they totally disconnect.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about us with the disciples? Do we find the disciples to be all good, all bad in that story? Even just in that story?
Not too good.
It's not great. But you can sort of understand. They've gone to get Jesus food. They want him to eat. They care about him. So that's nice. Yeah, hey, come on, eat something. Of course, they misunderstand everything that's going on. But so actually, every character is kind of complex. But what about the villagers? We only have a glimpse of the villagers. They come across the field. They arrive. And then next thing we know, they're telling the woman, it's not because of you that we believe. We've heard for ourselves, and we've come to believe that Jesus is this man is the Savior of the world. Are they a nice village?
Yeah, I think so. I like them.
You like them because they're responsive. You must be an evangelist, right? But they're the same village that treated her as if she was dirt.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Just even within a story like that, every character is complex.
Except Jesus.
What about Jesus? We all like Jesus. But actually, he's doing something quite awkward in that conversation, isn't he? And it's like we are a lot like the disciples. When the disciples are stood around looking at Jesus, they're going, ooh, hey, John, ask Peter. He'll usually do the talking. Peter, ask Jesus why he's talking to a woman. I'm not going to ask him. You ask him. Oh, I'll ask her then. I'm not going to ask her. That humiliates him. And they're feeling this incredible tension because what Jesus is doing is completely inappropriate. He's chatting to a woman in the middle of the day on their own. Yeah, it's good that it wasn't at night like Nicodemus, but even so, middle of the day at a well. What happens at wells in Jewish history? People get married, right? There's always, go through Genesis, everyone's proposing at a well. And what's Jesus saying to the woman? I mean, the way it comes across, that first statement, give me water. And then she says, oh, okay. And then he says, if you knew who it was that was asking you, you'd ask me and I'd give you living water. Is that some kind of spiritual, amazing statement? Yes. What did it sound like? Here's my phone number. It sounds like he's trying to get into some sort of relational connection with this woman, right? And that's what she would have thought. 5 husbands living in sin, and a man is talking to her. That's her life story right there. All right, everyone knows that she's available, and every woman in the village knows that she's a threat. And here's a man, a stranger, who's talking to her, and he's asking her, saying tricky things that she doesn't understand. She thinks, I don't get it, but I know the follow-up is going to be something about, hey, what are you doing next? Right? And so actually, even Jesus in that story creates tension. And if you preach that story in a traditional church where Jesus, you can't ever say anything like I just said about Jesus, you will create tension if you help people to see the reality of that situation, that she is like, whoa, what? And actually there's a progression there. And so when he says to her, go call your husband, suddenly she goes, I perceive that you are a prophet. And she's changed from sir, or from you, a Jew. So now she's saying you're a prophet. And she, I think, just out of tension in the whole situation, like this is a prophet that's trying to have a relationship with this, is really awkward. Whatever she's thinking at that point, she says, change the subject. Right, let's talk religion. You talk religion with Jesus, that's great fun. He's like, yeah, I can do that. I mean, if you'd have said politics or sport, he could have done that too. But I mean, religion is kind of Jesus' subject. Right? And so she goes right into where he wants to go. And so the whole thing, actually, if you tell it like it's just a Bible truth, it's okay. But once you start putting skin onto the story and you start feeling how the disciples were feeling and how confused they were by what Jesus said and how awkward she felt. I mean, that moment when the 12 disciples are stood there and they're nudging each other, and they're looking at her and looking at him and looking at her and looking at him, and they're going, you ask, I'm not asking, you ask, I'm not asking. Imagine what she was feeling. uh-oh, now there's 12 men staring at me and elbowing each other. And so she goes back to the village and she leaves her water jar. That's how awkward the moment was. So you enter into a story, suddenly people are going, I can imagine that. Oh yeah, that's how I would feel. That's interesting. And it becomes a story instead of just some information. But some of that's going to come from the setting and the description of what's going on. And that just takes work. We've got to do the work of entering in, of pondering it. And I would suggest also talk to somebody about it. Because, for example, with John 4, you might be so fixed in your mind that Jesus is simply the Messiah, which he is, that everything he says sounds messianic, and that she would have you see it as if it's just stained glass religious stuff, and you chat with a friend about it and they say, actually it looks like he's chatting her up. You go, I never thought of that. And so talking about story with someone else, even if that's not right, it just makes you think about it. And talk, if you're a man, talk to a woman about a story, because they can, women relate to women as well. I mean, women get men better than men do as well. But, if men just talk to men and think we understand everything, that's very restricted. And equally, ladies, if you're teaching a story, in Sunday school, don't miss the chance to talk to a husband or a friend or something. Hey, how do you see this? Because we have a different way of viewing women and a different way of viewing men, and women have a different way of viewing women and a different way of viewing men. And I think actually maybe women could help us understand the tensions between women, because that's a world that women live with. We don't feel that tension as men, right? But Mary and Martha, what tension was there in those 4 verses? Maybe, getting different input can be really helpful. Okay, so number 3 on the page, let's think about that. Third person and first person preaching. I mean, thinking about first person, because we're so used to third person, right? We're used to talking about the story. I'm going to tell you the story about someone else. And so you need to think through how can you do that. And sometimes it's, it can be the best way to do it. But if you're preaching narrative, at some point you need to think about doing a first person. It just forces you to go into a story in a different way. Because it's not easy. It's not less work. It's way more work. And so I don't know anyone that can consistently do first person. Haddon Robinson's son, Tory, is a pastor in New York, and he ended up doing his doctoral studies on first person preaching and wrote a book about it. And his church love it. He said, every time I did a first person, everyone was talking about it. They could remember the main point. People's lives were challenged. It just seemed to be such an effective way. And he said, I cannot do more than 1 in 8. So about every 8 weeks, he'll do a first person. But no, he can't do 1 in 4. It's just too much work. Because you've got to do all the same work that you do for a normal sermon, plus extra. You've got to be able to enter into that person's experience and talk with authority. Imagine that you're talking to somebody down here in the Disney jungle or whatever that area is called, and you're sitting down in the reception area and you're talking to somebody and you say, hey, tell me about yourself. And they go, yeah, I'm married. I've got 3 children. The oldest one is 6. That would be the strangest thing ever, wouldn't it? You think, who is this person? Is this a spy? Like, what is happening? Not a very good spy, Because when we're talking about our own experience, we can all talk about our own experience. We can just access memories and descriptions, and we can say what the person was looking like, And so to preach first person, we have to enter into that world. We need to know culture. We need to make sure we don't make mistakes. I checked my watch and oops, I didn't have a watch. We've got to make sure that we really enter into that culture, that world. We need to know the story inside and out. We need to have explored it, prayed about it, and we need to make sure that what we preach is what the text is saying. We don't use the text as a doorway to access some creative new message. We're not prophets. We use the text to access the story, and then we preach the text. Okay, so what are some of the challenges? You've got to think about who is where. So first of all, who? Like which character are you going to be? So, for example, let's say you wanted to preach John 4. That's not an easy one, actually. Who could you be, first person? What are the options?
Samaritan woman.
Right, so there's the Samaritan woman option. I wouldn't encourage the men to do that because it's just distracting. You know?
Try to talk like a woman.
Yes. Never change your voice. It's just so hard to maintain a false voice. I heard a sermon by a guy who did Samson. And he started off, "My name is Samson." I was like, oh my word. How are you going to keep that going? And he tried and it was horrible. It was so distracting. It's not every story is as easy as every other story for first person, but it's worth thinking about. And actually make sure, like I said before, make sure you're communicating the point of the text. So you have to do all the exegesis of the text first to determine what is this text trying to communicate, and then maybe think about first person, then do all the extra work so you can describe it. You need to be able to describe everything that you can. And the challenge then becomes, well, what if you don't know?
But can you jump in and out? Like,
Yeah.
for a short while, you are this person, and then you tell the story, and then you can be another person.
Changing characters, I think, is difficult, but you could. You can switch between being the preacher and being in character. And sometimes people do that because, so it kind of sets up the next question. First question is which character, and then where is the character as he's preaching or she's preaching? Is this welcome to Sychar? Over here, there's a well. You know, has the audience come to the character? You won't believe what happened yesterday. You know, it's quiet now, but it wasn't then. Let me tell you what's happened. That means that you've traveled through time into my world 2,000 years ago. Alternatively, I can come to your world. And I'm from a place from 2,000 years ago called Sychar. And that's a different type of message. Okay, now the advantage of bringing people back there is that you don't need to talk about today. But that's also the disadvantage. So back there, you can describe things, you can bring people in. It's like a tour guide of the story, in effect. You're sort of inviting them into that world. But you have to craft it in such a way that the applications can transfer without you saying them. Whereas if you come to today and you say, you know, I can't explain the process, but I've been invited to join you, and somehow here I am in 2014, and I understand the country's name is Poland. Well, my country is like, you know, and then you can talk about where you're from, and you can talk to those people, and if you're careful, you can make it slightly more relevant to their world. From what I've been told by my host, you struggle with this in your culture too. You know, and there can be a slight sort of step over into the modern world. But it's just as it's difficult to go back then, it's hard to really imagine what someone from back then would be saying to us today. They'd probably be having a nervous breakdown at just so many differences, absolute culture shock. And you don't want to have someone in character who's having a nervous breakdown. That's kind of awkward to watch. Okay, so it's false, but you need to make it as believable as you can, and you need to be consistent. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge in third person as well, because to tell a story, you have to say more than the text says. You know, if you go to an airport, and I always talk about airport paperbacks, you know, the kind of books that I don't believe people would really choose to buy, but they sell them in airports, just big old books of fiction, you know. It's not true, people do buy them obviously, but if you get a modern fiction, cheap, not very good modern fiction, what you tend to get is description for pages and pages and pages, right? The woman sitting in the bar, and then she saw him. As he entered the doorway, he was wearing Levi 506s, and he had these kind of boots on, and his belt buckle said Jack Daniels, and his shirt was neatly creased, and you know, his hair was slightly off to one. You can be like, before he says anything, you know, just massive description, and it's good communication in the sense that as a reader you're imagining it, which is what we're doing as preachers, but we're preaching a text that doesn't do that. The text doesn't give us unnecessary detail. What today takes 100 pages, the Bible can cover in 10 verses. It's very precise. And so typically don't get any physical description, which is helpful if for first person. You know, people don't know that you're not like so and so, so that's helpful. But we don't get physical description. We don't tend to get much background information. We don't tend to get clothing descriptions and that kind of thing. Typically, the main thing we have is dialogue, and dialogue is usually brief, but it's the window we're given, and we have to read into that dialogue the character of the person. And so you've got the challenge whenever you're preaching a story. If you just read the story and it takes 50 seconds, like the two men going to the temple, or 3 minutes, like John 4, how do you preach for half an hour? Because if you can just tell it that quick, there's nothing much more you can say if you're going to tell that story without adding information. And so the challenge then becomes, how do you know that information is true? Because if you're just speculating, your information could change the meaning of the text, and then you've created a real problem. So I would say two things. First of all, you've got to study like crazy to really know your stuff. Don't just go with the first thing you think of, but research and study. But then also, when you communicate it, you've got to decide in third person whether you say, this happened, or whether you say, I wonder if something like this might be what's going on. And you can preface speculation with, to the best of my understanding, I think this is probably the situation. You know, I read John 4, and I can't tell whether Jesus is coming across as a flirt to her, in her perspective, or just as an enigma. I can't really tell the difference. And so I'll say, you know what, from her perspective, she might actually think he's flirting here. Probably does, but I'm not certain of that. In first person, you can't be uncertain of things. And so there's the challenge, is can you, if you're not certain, can you just avoid that part of the story? Sometimes not. But I think in first person, typically your audience will give you some space for creativity. They'll understand that you're being creative. So there's a bit more flexibility than if you just make declarations in third person preaching. So it's a tension to wrestle with. But the one thing you don't want to do is be unprepared. If you're unprepared, you're making stuff up, you're going to get into all sorts of confusion. Yeah.
Do you have, especially if you preach at first person, you have to be very expressive. So I think that besides just studying and do your job very well, you also have to preach home, to yourself, to
run it through, practice it. Yeah.
Just try to get to the entire sermon.
Yeah, and I think you can be expressive. You don't have to be false. That's the problem with acting, is that we're not actors. And professional actors are professional for a reason. The fact that people get on Hollywood movies is because they can act. And it's very rare that you're watching a movie and you think, that's bad acting. Normally, it's very believable, isn't it? And actually, you try doing that. You try to play the part of a criminal or try to play the part of a police officer. Actually, it's quite hard. And so if we try to act and we're not actors, it just looks awkward, and the people listening go, oh, this is embarrassing. I hope no guests are here. But if we kind of almost allow ourselves to be ourselves in character, which is probably what actors do as well, incidentally, but instead of forcing this persona that's not there, just let your personality be involved a little bit, but make sure that doesn't contradict. So I don't think you have to have elaborate costume. I think costume is distracting. If you're going to have any costume or prop, let it just be one thing. And so if you're playing the part of a farmer or a shepherd or something, having a crook and leaning on it would be fine. But dressing up in old curtains and towels and things, you just look like a child at Christmas. It's not good. And so we don't need to do all the props and things. Simple or nothing. Use your own voice. Don't try to put on a Middle Eastern accent. Just people will translate. Polish accent. He's obviously playing the part of someone from Israel. I can envisage that. And so it doesn't need to be a massive step from where we are, but it needs to be fluid. It needs to make sense, and it needs to be convincing.
Can I ask a question? What would you do if you would try to represent Samson? Would you get a week at least? I'm because everybody thinks, how can you be Samson? You're not strong, but you don't have hair either, What would you do? What do you think?
I'd be tempted. I mean, I haven't really thought about it. I'd be tempted to just wear a hat and just take hair out of the equation, and just kind of, I don't know. But
If I would preach to children, I would probably take a week.
I think with children you can do more. You can do more dressing up because they enjoy it. But with adults, there's always someone that's like,
you're a clown.
yeah, you're messing around. I'm not taking you seriously.
You can, I think, easily show that your hair is like this. Give them a description how the person will look, and they can.
Yeah,
it's gonna stick in their mind.
You don't have to be blind either.
Yeah.
You don't have to cut your eyes out to be Samson.
Yeah, but I think you have to specify it at least.
Yeah.
You don't have a wig at least to say, yeah, my hair is very long, as you know.
Yeah, you can do that kind of thing. I think you can be creative. It is possible to do first person in a contemporary form, an alternative. I don't think that can be the whole sermon, though. That's a situation where you tell a story that tells the Bible story, and then you switch back to preaching and you go to the Bible. And so you could do a first person contemporary equivalent, and then go third person story telling from the Bible. And so, for example, the Pharisee and the tax collector, I preached a few years ago in a church, and I knew that the people in the church would not feel the force of that story if it was told just from the Bible, because they know the characters. It doesn't feel shocking to them. And so I retold the story, not first person, but I retold it in a modern form. And I deliberately changed it, because if I said two men went to a church prayer meeting, it's like they would know already what I was doing. So I just started my sermon with a story about a brother and a sister raised in a Christian home. And I made it contemporary, and I talked about these two lives and how they'd gone in such different directions. And she was very involved in a church, on lots of committees and very busy. The brother got in with the wrong crowd, ended up on drugs, homeless, complete mess. And I just kept telling the story, ended up with it actually on Christmas Day. She's at the table with her family, and she prays and thanks God for all the blessings and how wonderful her life is and how great she is. And at the same time, her brother's sitting in a motel room, just ready to commit suicide. He's so desperate and just despairing before God. And then I put the point of the story in our kind of terms. I said, fast forward a little bit, they both died. He went to heaven, she didn't. Now that's kind of the story, but actually it was very deliberately paralleling the story. And having told the story, I said, actually I made that story up, but here's the real story. Turn with me to Luke 18. And then we went back to Luke 18 and we looked at it. Some months later, I discovered that some people in the church were very offended by that introduction, like really upset by it. And when I heard that, I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. No, I'm not sorry to hear that. Tell me who was it? And I heard who it was, and I went, okay, good. Because that's exactly the right response to that story. And that was a success in the sense that, not that I try to offend people, but that parable is offensive to religious people. And the fact that the religious people got offended told me that I'd done something right on that occasion. Okay, so we've got to be creative, but not so creative that we lose our authority. And the fact is, if I had just done that and offended them, it wouldn't have helped. But I was able to then immediately go back to Luke 18, and there's nobody in the room that wouldn't have said, yeah, actually, your introduction was this story right here, just in a different form. Okay, so you've got to be sensitive, but allow the creativity to come through with narratives. Okay, your introduction and your conclusions are really important anyway, but especially if you preach first person. You're going to have to really think that through in terms of, do I just start in character like you described? Or do I introduce and then turn around and then come back as in character? Do I have somebody else introduce the character? At the end, do I apply it as the character, or do I switch back to me to make the application, or do I have another pastor in the church step up and make 3 points of application? There's lots of different ways, but you've got to plan it. If you don't plan, it's going to be a mess. Okay, so flexibility on that. One creative thing as well, and just I'm not sure how I've never seen this done in a full sermon, but I've done this in a short talk. I did a first person in a contemporary form, so a modernized version of the story. And actually what I did was I told the story of Potiphar and Joseph, and the tension that Potiphar felt when he caught Joseph with his wife, right? And I thought, I don't want to dress up for this, but I need to do this story. It's part of this program that I'm doing. And so I decided to make it a contemporary Potiphar. So I put on my business clothes, loosened my tie, made myself look a bit stressed and a bit sweaty, under my shirt, and I had a cigar and a cigarette lighter. And that was my symbol of wealth, right? And so everyone listening was immediately interested because they thought, is he really going to smoke? Right? And I kept, all the way through, I was telling a story about Joseph and how Joseph had come to me and how Joseph had turned out to be this amazing slave, and everything he did was wonderful and everything he touched turned to gold, and I'm so wealthy, I don't need to do a thing because Joseph just handles it all. Actually, let me, and I just kept doing that all the way through, and then the frustration with the wife and all the tensions that Potiphar actually didn't believe his wife. He knew she was lying, but he was trapped and he trusted Joseph more than he trusted his wife. And so that's why he didn't kill Joseph instantly, but put him in the nice prison. But now he'd lost his best worker. And what's going to happen now? I mean, everything's worked so perfectly. And now, and I just kept going like this. And that was the tension. And the problem was, okay, now Joseph's gone. The blessing of the Lord is on Joseph. Does Potiphar have a problem? And eventually I got to the end, and I went to light it, and the lighter didn't work. And I just blocked it. I just made it so it didn't light. And I was finished, but it was a very contemporary presentation of the Potiphar tension. But the thing was, it was text-driven. It had to be text-driven. It was fun. It was really fun. So, there's different ways to do that. But think about it. I want to really encourage you, as you're preaching narrative, enter into it and then think about how to preach it creatively. Now, don't do something like that at a funeral. That's not appropriate. If your church is really traditional, don't be extravagant in your creativity. Save it for the youth. Practice there. But you can gradually introduce good storytelling where you're really telling the story of Scripture so that people are entering into it. And I tell you, they will fall in love with narrative sections of the Bible once they start to see it on the screen of their hearts. We're almost done here, but let me just wrap up the notes for the last couple of minutes here. Right at the bottom, say what it says, do what it does. Vocabulary. Here's an idea. If you're preaching a story or any passage from a certain book, why not think about trying to use the words that book uses, not just quoting it. So, for example, I preached the story of the resurrection of Jesus from Luke a few years ago. And I decided in my preparation, I don't just want to, it's very easy to preach the resurrection and to sound like 1 Corinthians 15. Do you know what I mean? 1 Corinthians 15 is the standard passage on the resurrection, and it's very easy to read the gospel account and sound like 1 Corinthians. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to sound like Luke. And so I studied Luke, and I got to know his terms. They're not the same as John. Luke is not about belief and light and darkness and truth and Father and Son. In Luke, it's today, salvation, spirit. It's different language. And so I went through my whole sermon and I made sure that the vocabulary was Luke. And I wasn't trying to impress anybody. I just wanted to make sure that I was really communicating his message, not just a general message, but this passage. And it actually made the message quite different from what I anticipated. When you think Easter Sunday resurrection, you think you know what you're going to say. But actually, studying Luke, there was some very definite content in Luke that was unique. And so I'd encourage you, think about even those little details. And not that everybody should notice. In that case, one person did notice, my brother-in-law. He came up to me and he said, "Were you deliberately using Luke language?" And I said, "Yeah, how do you know?" He said, "I thought so. That was really helpful. I like that." And that was cool, But I didn't want people to know that. I just felt before God a greater integrity. If I'm preaching this passage, I want to preach this passage. And so just those kind of things that you don't normally think about. But it's worth pondering. What else have I got on there? Mood. So we talked about reading. tension, sermonic movement. I don't remember what that means, but you can think about how you move about on the stage or in front of people. You know, whether there's a progression in the story, whether this place is over here and this place is over there. If the well is always there, talk at the well, don't move the well around. You know, and also the movement of the sermon itself, not just your movement, but a sense of progression and a sense of energy, that people don't feel like they're sitting still, but they're going somewhere with you.